Well, last time we were looking at the events of the Jewish war against the Romans, and we're coming towards the end of that. We saw how that Vespasian was dispatched to the area, the Roman general, and he went through towns of Galilee and then Judea, and finally came up to the city of Jerusalem. And at that point, Nero committed suicide, the Emperor Nero. So there was turmoil back in Rome. Several people came on the throne for a brief period of time, and then Vespasian was called back to Rome, and he became the next emperor. And he left his son Titus in charge of the siege of Jerusalem. And so that's where we are in your notes and in our narrative, looking at what will be the fall of Jerusalem. To this point, we saw that before the siege and at the beginning of the siege, as the Roman armies were there was a lot of infighting between different zealot groups within Jerusalem. There was fighting against some Idumeans who had come into the city. So there were a lot of dead people. There's a lot of starvation. So a lot of corpses are thrown over the wall. A lot of corpses are rotting in the streets of Jerusalem. It is a terrible, terrible situation. So we want to continue looking at what is going on there, and we'll see that it's not going to get much better. So here we are under devastation, the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. A point of reference in the Gospels is Matthew 24, because Jesus there foretells what's going to happen, and that is what's happening here in 70 AD. So within a month of the Roman troops breaking down the walls, as you can see here, they came in from the north because, as I told you before, there are deep valleys on the sides of the city, and so the only place to really attack is up here. And then we got through what's called the third wall, and then there's a second wall, and before they break through into where the temple is. And these arrows show the Roman advance. I mean, the Roman strength is invincible. You might win a few battles, but you're not going to win long term against the Roman army at this point. Rome had taken over the known world and had been in control of it for quite some time. Well, the legions of the Roman army eventually overcome these different walls and came streaming into the temple area. Nothing could restrain them. Josephus says that Titus did not want the temple to be destroyed because he appreciated architecture. He tried to preserve buildings like that in different parts of the world. So he, according to Josephus, gave instructions not to destroy it. Well, we'll see why it was destroyed in a few minutes. As the soldiers came into the temple area, and the temple area particularly is where many of the zealots were holed up. They were kind of congregated there. But many people were killed as the Romans came in, most of them unarmed citizens. Around the holy altar, corpses piled up and slid in a river of blood down the steps, according to Josephus. Now, Titus, like I said, offered to spare the temple if only the rebels barricaded within would come outside and fight. So he said, if you come out and fight, I'll leave the temple alone. I won't touch it. But they refused. Instead, these zealots that were in the temple actually set fire to portions of the building rather than let the enemy take possession of it. When Roman troops, against Titus's orders, continued the burning, he tried in vain to stop them. Again, according to Josephus. Now, remember that Jesus had predicted in Matthew 24 that there would not be one stone left upon another. You remember that? His disciples coming out of the temple said to Jesus, "Oh, look at this wonderful building." And Jesus said, "I tell you, there'll come a time when there won't be one stone left on another." Now, the stones of the temple of Jerusalem are huge, and to think that they would somehow be toppled down is difficult even to imagine. But that's what Jesus said would happen, and that's what happened. And it comes about as a result of the, let's see, something happened here. Oh, we've already got past that, sorry. Okay, this will help us here. So coming to the temple, zealots had set it on fire. The Romans perpetuated the fires. And what happened is that the fire caused the gold, which overlaid the temple. A lot of things were coated in gold, and the fire caused the gold to melt down. And as it melted down into the cracks between the huge stone blocks of which the walls were constructed. So in order to get at the gold that was settling in between the cracks, Roman soldiers completely dismantled the blocks that formed the walls of the temple, thus fulfilling what Jesus had predicted. So otherwise, it would have been left standing. But because the fire caused the gold to melt, to get at the gold, they removed the blocks. And so they were left not standing one upon the other. And so Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed by Titus after 5 months siege in on September the 2nd, AD 70. And so here we have what the temple did look like. Here's the southern steps where the preaching on the day of Pentecost took place. Here are different archways leading into the temple. This one is partially still there. The other ones have fallen off. And here are people trying to escape. The Romans carrying some things away already, like the menorah. You can see the fire all around. So, Roman troops reached the temple. Everyone in Jerusalem was killed, except those who could be sold as slaves. Josephus says that there were a little over 1 million people killed. 1,197,000. Tacitus, the Roman historian, says 600,000 were killed. It's difficult to know which one is accurate. Josephus might have a better idea, being that he was Jewish. He knew how many people usually were there for Passover, and this occurred some months after that, but a lot of that time people could not get out. According to Josephus, 97,000 were taken as slaves. And how did they determine who would be taken as slaves? Well, the Romans had a very practical way of doing it. They simply lined the people up and went down the row and decided, nah, she wouldn't make a good slave, kill her. Oh, she'd look a good slave, okay, take her. Nah, he's too old, he's 80 years old, kill him. He's got good muscles on him, we'll take him as a slave. He looks too scholarly, we don't want any smart people, so kill him. You know, literally just went down and decided who to kill and who to take a slave. There wasn't anybody left in the city of Jerusalem that was not either killed or a slave. And they're not going to take slaves of people that wouldn't make good slaves, right? So that's what happened. Terrible, terrible devastation to the people in the city, let alone the buildings. The very best of the slaves, you know, so Noah here is, you know, he's really buff, he's a strong guy, and so, he's a great slave. We'll take him to Rome, and he'll be a gladiator. So that's what happened to some of them. Later on, Titus would march triumphantly through Rome, bearing the golden menorah from the temple, as you see here, the menorah being taken out. Now, this is still Jerusalem. He took this out. You can see them bearing it there, but he took that into Rome and paraded before him hundreds of Jewish captives. And then this procession was memorialized by a huge ark built in Rome. Now, I want to go back to something. Jesus told his followers that when they saw the abomination of desolation, that they would know that these things were going to happen, that is the destruction of the temple and in Jerusalem. Now, the abomination of desolation, where I talked before, remember under Antiochus Epiphanes, he went into the Holy of Holies and erected a statue of Zeus there with his picture on it, and killed pigs and, scattered the juice all over. Remember that. When Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, I don't think he meant that they were to wait until somebody actually was in the Holy of Holies of Holies doing that. He's looking at that as an example. So what they would recognize about the abomination of desolation is that when there are foreign troops there ready to come in, recognize that that's the time. And as I told you before, when that happened, the Christians in Jerusalem escaped. They got out. And so as far as I know, there were no Christians killed in Jerusalem when the Romans came in because they had already left, as per Jesus' instructions. So this actually did occur. Now this is looking at Matthew 24, and I'll tell you a disclaimer here that most American Christians see Matthew 24, or at least part of it, as being still future. I'm going to say my opinion is that, and this is not the opinion of Heartland Christian School or of any particular churches, this is solely from my study, okay? So this is just me talking here. It seems to me that everything Jesus said in Matthew 24 actually did happen in 70 AD, if you compare what he said with Josephus. For example, we had the judgment on Jerusalem, according to history, and destruction of the temple. These are some of the things that occurred just before the destruction of the temple. Interesting stuff, and Josephus tells us about this. They saw a star resembling a sword. Possibly Halley's Comet came by. It did come by at that time. We know that from historical records. And Halley's Comet, as a comet does, it has a tail. And if it came by just right, a tail doesn't go out behind a comet. It might be in front of it. It might be any direction. But apparently the tail at this time was pointing down, which the people of Jerusalem thought it looked like there was a sword pointing at them. So they looked at it and said, whoa, that doesn't look good for us. Okay, so there's this comet. A bright light shining around the altar in the temple. Suddenly there was a bright light there. There was a vision of chariots and soldiers running around among the clouds in all cities of Palestine. So they looked up in the clouds and they saw all kinds of soldier activity in the clouds, in the sky. There was earthly phenomena. There was quaking, and the priest reported this. There was a great noise. In fact, one of the great noises was the sounds of a great multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." In other words, they heard, it sounded like a multitude of voices saying together in unison in the temple, "Let's get out of here." Now that would freak you out, wouldn't it? I don't think I have it on here, but there was also a time just before the Romans came in when the huge door of the temple, which was something that not one man could move, suddenly just opened. So some crazy stuff happened, and so I'm of the opinion that everything that Jesus predicted did happen. So this guy's walking around instead of the end is coming. He said it happened already in 70 AD. All right, but that's not the end of the war. There's still some zealots left who are not in Jerusalem. Now, contrary to, did all of you see the movie Masada? Did you see that with Mr. Lamb?
Mm-hmm.
You didn't? Oh, you weren't here then? What grade was that?
6.
Oh, 6th grade. As I watched that movie, there are a couple things, when they can make a movie, they always, play around with some facts. But the movie gave the impression that the guy who was the leader down at Masada had been in Jerusalem. I don't know if you remember that or not. He wasn't. All right, everybody who was in Jerusalem was either killed or enslaved. Anybody who was in Masada had gotten there before the Romans came to Jerusalem. You remember Masada is down here next to the Dead Sea. I've showed you some pictures before. Here's looking at it from the top, and that's where many of the zealots then was their last stronghold, the last ditch effort to defend themselves against the Romans. Because once the Romans captured Jerusalem, they didn't stop and say, "Oh, okay, that's it. We don't need any more." No, they kept after any groups of Jews that they thought might be in rebellion, and so they continued on to the south, down into the Negev, the desert area, down into wilderness areas, all the way down to Masada, and destroyed communities that they found along the way, including groups of Essenes. You remember the Essenes? Those were the extreme Pharisees who went off to live by themselves. Well, Romans came upon communities of Essenes. They didn't ask them, okay, are you a zealot or an Essene, which is what are you? No, they just destroyed them. They didn't ask any questions. Oh, here's a group of Jews living out here in the desert. Destroy them. And that's what they did. And I think that's probably what happened to the community at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So there were zealots that went to Herod's fortress down here in Masada. The Romans had occupied this prior to the Zealots taking it. The Romans had been in control of Masada for 60 years. And the Zealots captured it in AD 66, just 4 years before this, and managed to hold it throughout the war. And more Zealots joined them over that time period, and it's where they make their final stand. Well, the guy who's in charge of the Roman forces going down here is Judea's new procurator or governor, whose name was Flavius Silva. And he came up with an ingenious plan for breaching this heretofore impregnable fortress and snuffing out the Jewish rebellion. So, taking a cue from what Titus did in Jerusalem, first he built a wall around the base of the mountain. So he built a wall around here, just like Titus had done in Jerusalem, so anybody trying to get out would not be able to get out. Then he ordered his troops to begin work on a massive earthen ramp. Now the reason for that is that there is a trail that goes up here. It's on the other side. It's over on this side, I believe. But if you try to go up the trail, you're in danger of getting hit by any projectiles that those up on top can hurl at you, and you're not going to make it. So he decided instead to build an earth ramp. And here's the trail that goes up. You just keep piling dirt up until finally you've got an incline that you can bring your siege engines up, your soldiers up, and attack there. Okay, does that make sense? That's what they're trying to do. Now here's what Masada looked like from looking down on it. Here's a largely built up area, a lot of rooms, a lot of buildings here. I think this is the palace over here, different buildings along here. This is pretty open. Down here is the baths, a couple different levels there. That you'll see a better picture maybe later. Yeah, here we can see it a little bit better. So a lot of the remains of these buildings are still there, and you can see where this was, as well as this down here. That's quite a little drop down to there. Here's where they built the ramp, over here on the side. Some of these are buildings that were either taken by different groups like the Byzantine Church, or built there. Here's the palace. Here's looking out toward the Dead Sea. I think we saw this before. Look at just how dry it is. Nothing grows there. There's a little bit of greenish there, but must be a little water flowing through there. It's a desolate area. Here's some more of the wall around the edge. There's quite a bit of space on top. You'd think maybe that was out in the desert somewhere, but that's on top. Some narrow passageways up there as well. This is a drawing that shows the baths that they had. They had water to wash themselves ceremonially. And they had huge cisterns there to collect water. So they had plenty of water. It could have lasted for years with the water and the grain that Herod had stored up and the Romans had before the Zealots got there. This is looking down in a cistern Here's an area for grain storage. This is the synagogue. Here's the way it looks today, the synagogue. You can see partial pillar here of the pillars that were there, and these are the seats that were around the synagogue. Of course, most of it's gone, just that little part of it's there. It's maybe the oldest synagogue in the world that's still in existence. Bottom rows for elders. That's why I sat there. This is a scroll room. This is where they keep all the scrolls of Scripture. Apparently had paintings on the inside of the walls. The walls were all painted with colorful paint, pictures. Here's again looking out towards the Dead Sea. It's one of the towers. Palace. This is how you can get up there today, following the pathway. Or take the easy way and go on a tram that ends up here and you walk there. That's looking down on the bath area. Now, here you can still see the outlines of where the Roman camps were outside the base. Some of the roads that are there. There are a number of camps that were located around. Oh, there's the entertainment hall, and then there's the bathhouse down there. So here's the entertainment hall. Here's the bathhouse. There's another Roman encampment. Amazing, after 2,000 years, that you can still see where those were. Another one. There's the camp over here. Closer up. See the Dead Sea a little bit better here. I just want to say, I mean, can you tell how desolate an area this is? I mean, you wouldn't want to live there. And up on top of that tabletop of Masada, very hot. In fact, it was so hot the day we were there, it wouldn't allow people to walk up the trail because it was 100, 120 degrees. They wouldn't let anybody walk it. They were afraid people would fall over. All right, so a wall was built around the base. He orders troops to begin work on a massive earthen ramp. But the problem is, as the Roman soldiers are bringing dirt over to pile up, what's happening? Well, the zealots up above are shooting at them, shooting arrows, throwing rocks. So that didn't seem too safe of an idea then. So what they did was the Roman commander, Silva, ordered for slaves to be brought down from Jerusalem and made them do the work of moving dirt and rock. So those up on Masada trying to defend themselves, now they've got a choice. We either kill our own people who are building this ramp or allow them to do it. Pretty smart on Silva's part. And little by little, the ramp grew until it climbed 300 feet with a platform and tower on top and reached the fortress. So you can see the ramp has been built, and here's the huge siege tower that's been brought to the top so that they can break through the wall on any of these levels, break through and enter into the fortress. After 5 months, this huge battering ram was wheeled up the ramp and used to crash through the main wall. Here's looking down at the ramp from above. There's a ramp down that way. So here's the siege tower. Inside, after that first wall was broken, inside there was a second wall made out of timber and earth. And behind that were the zealots barricaded. And that wall was set on fire. At that point, the people of Masada knew there was no hope. There was no way they could hold off the Romans. Once they had broken through the outer wall, the inner wall was set on fire. It's just a matter of when they're going to break through. Well, the Romans, it was late in the day, so the Romans decided to wait till the next day to actually break through that second wall. And when they broke in, they found no one there to fight them. They were expecting to break through and there'd be an immediate fight, but didn't happen. They weren't sure what was going on, so they began to look around. They didn't see anybody until they started looking into some rooms, and they found a lot of dead bodies. Eventually, they found a couple ladies and some children who had been hiding in one of the empty cisterns, and those people told them what had happened. That there was 960 men, women, and children who took their own lives rather than be captured by the Romans. They said death is better than slavery to the Romans. And so they divided up into groups and families, and the person in charge would kill everyone in his family, and then he would be killed by somebody else in that group until finally everyone was dead. There were 2 women and 5 children who were left, and that brought an end to this 7-year war of the Jews trying to break from the bondage of Rome. Okay, what are the results? Well, the first thing is the Jews no longer occupied the city of Jerusalem. Secondly, and then there was one. All the different groups we talked about, the political religious groups of different Jewish people at the time of Christ, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, the Essenes, the Herodians. After the fall of Jerusalem, there's only one left. There are no more Sadducees because they were attached to the temple. And when the temple was destroyed, they ceased to exist as a viable political religious party. Well, there are no Zealots because they're the ones leading the rebellion, and they're all killed. They fought to the bitter end, but they ceased to exist then as a viable political religious party. Well, even though the Essenes had separated themselves into remote communities, Roman legions destroyed them as possible threats, and they ceased to exist as a viable political religious party. Well, never a very large party, the Herodians' reason for existence, that is, survival of Israel through cooperation with Rome and the adoption of Greco-Roman culture, died with the destruction of Jerusalem. And so they too ceased to exist as a viable political religious party. Because of the great popularity throughout the diaspora, the party of the Pharisees not only continued to exist, but became the group that defined Judaism for the next 1,800 years. So if you say anything about the Jewish religion after this, up to the present day, you're really talking about the religion of the Pharisees. They're the only ones left standing. And I see I have a typo. It should be, now you see them, now you don't, instead of no, you see them. This event demonstrates the end of the Old Covenant. We know that Jesus came to initiate a new covenant. The Old Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant, the Old Testament, the sacrificial system was to be done away. But God planned a 40-year period of trial, of ceasing the old covenant to take place. So from the time that Jesus died on the cross until the destruction of the temple was approximately 40 years. And at the end of that 40-year period, there is no more old covenant. There is no more sacrificial system. It's gone. It's done. No one could say after 70 AD, let's practice the Jewish religion and really mean the Mosaic covenant, because there's no temple. There's nowhere to offer sacrifices. There's no priesthood. They're all dead. There's no way to practice the Jewish faith according to the Old Testament. It's done. God destroyed it all. So all that's left then is the new covenant under Jesus Christ. The destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, many rabbis refer to 70 AD as the end of biblical Judaism. The destruction of Jerusalem indeed demonstrated that the kingdom had been taken away from the Jewish nation and given to Christ's followers, and provided final testimony to that generation as to who Jesus was. It clearly showed that God was not interested in a physical empire for the Jews, but rather in the spiritual reign of Jesus over all peoples. Jesus had told his crucifiers that they would see with their own eyes something which would vindicate his claims to be the Messiah. That vindication came in AD 70 when the Jewish nation was destroyed. And in fact, Josephus tells us that the people in Jerusalem at the time that the Romans were shooting these boulders into the city, as they used the limestone rocks around the area to shoot at them through the catapults, that the cry was, "The sun is coming." As they saw the S-U-N reflected off of those limestone rocks, they said the S-O-N is coming, and they said, we are being judged because we killed the Messiah. They understood that the judgment that was coming upon them was the judgment that Jesus had predicted would come upon them, because they rejected him as the Messiah. And so it was. The Christians fled Jerusalem and were seen as betrayers by later Jews, and so there became a separation and identification. That is, Christians did not identify themselves with the rebellion in Jerusalem, fleeing from the city into the mountains, just as Jesus had advised in Matthew 24. Particularly, they went to the city of Pella. They were seen as betrayers by later Jews, so much so that the rabbis added to the synagogue liturgy, their formal order of things and prayers in the synagogue, a prayer that condemned Jewish Christians. And so after that, they could not join in worship the synagogues. No Christians allowed. The great influx of Gentiles into the Christian movement helped to establish the church as a separate body from the Jews. Up until this time, Christians were looked at as just being another kind of Jew, like the Pharisee, the Sadducee, and the Christians, just one of those. But now they're looked at as separate. What had been viewed as simply another faction of the Jews, Christianity came to be understood as a separate entity altogether. Through the Age of Shadows. The reigns of Vespasian and Titus as Romans. Contemporary sources are silent about their treatment of the church. We don't have any indication as what they thought about the church. They probably didn't even know that Christians existed, really. Eusebius, the church historian, wrote about toleration. And here's the Ark of Titus that his brother built later to commemorate his victory over Jerusalem. And here's a close-up telling that this is the Arch of Titus. You see a lot of descriptive pictures, and here's one of the pictures which shows Titus in his chariot in his triumphal entry into the city of Rome. Here's another picture that shows them carrying treasures from the Temple of Jerusalem. You can see the menorah very clearly, Jewish slaves. And so that's all part of his victory march into the city. And we're going to skip that one. That one. Okay, here's what I just said about Eusebius wrote that there was toleration during the reigns of Vespasian and Titus. And then we come to Domitian, the brother of Titus. Under his rule, it was persecution. He persecuted Christians very strongly. Clement was killed by lions in the Colosseum. John, the apostle, was exiled to the Isle of Patmos. Now, I've changed my mind on this. Research that I've looked at more recently indicates that this took place before the destruction of Jerusalem, John's exile. So most people would say that it was during the time of Domitian, but I've come to the opinion that it was prior to that. Domitian's Christian wife was exiled to Gaul, and Domitian's Christian cousin was fed to the lions. So that takes us through the emperors associated with the destruction of Jerusalem, Vespasian, Titus, and then the son, another son of Vespasian, brother of Titus, Domitian, and he is the one that really goes after Christians big time.
As you are